Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the absolute most fascinating and honestly, most rigorous frameworks in all of ancient Vedic astrology. We're talking about the Kara Kamsa. We're going to explore exactly how the ancient sages mapped human destiny, how they diagnosed really severe diseases, predicted specific curses, and calculated extreme life-altering conditions like the Kamadrima Yoga. And they didn't just guess, by the way. They did this all through incredibly precise mathematical and astronomical calculations. So this isn't just about throwing out general predictions. It's a profoundly structured, research-based system. Let's get right into it.
Here's the roadmap for our deep dive today. We're going to progressively build your understanding from the ground up. We'll start with the foundational definitions and zodiac signs, then move into planetary afflictions, and from there, we'll actually get into the weeds with the complex astronomical math used to calculate planetary strength. Finally, we'll wrap up by examining those severe disease indicators and the dreaded Kamadrima Yoga.
All right, part one. Let's start by decoding the Karakamsa.
To make sense of this entire system, we first have to understand its core engine, which is the Atmakaraka. You can think of the Atmakaraka as basically your soul planet. Out of all the planets from the Sun all the way to Rahu, the Atmakaraka is simply the one that has traversed the absolute maximum number of degrees within a particular zodiac sign. It essentially represents the deepest desires and the ultimate trajectory of your soul. So once you've identified this Atmakaraka, you then have to go find where it sits in the Navamsha. That's the ninth divisional chart, the one used to analyze microscopic planetary strength. The specific sign that your Atmakaraka occupies in this Navamsa chart, that right there is the Karakamsa. And as laid down by Lord Brahma in the foundational shloka, verse 1, this single specific placement acts as the master blueprint for life's most profound effects.
Think about how the ancient sages mapped the heavens using the traditional Vedic astrological wheel. The Karakamsa isn't just some isolated dot on a page. It interacts dynamically with all 12 houses of this chart. When you place the Karakamsa in the ascendant, or the first house, the subsequent houses, the second, the third, the fourth, and so on, start pinpointing highly specific life events. It creates this incredibly logical connection between the indicator of your soul and the actual physical world you're experiencing every day.
So how does this actually play out in the signs? Let's move on to the zodiac signs and their specific outcomes. If we look at verses 2 through 8, the text systematically details environmental outcomes based on the sign. For instance, if your Karakamsa falls in Aries, verse 2 flat out states there will be a constant nuisance from rats and cats. Kinda highly specific, right? If it's in Cancer, there's an innate fear of water. Scorpio Navamsa brings troubles from snakes and potentially an affliction to the mother's breasts. But if it falls in Pisces, the 12th sign, it grants moksha, final spiritual emancipation. Now, the overarching rule to remember here is that if a benefic planet aspects these signs, it's going to remove those evils. But if a malefic planet casts an aspect, it will only intensify them.
Okay, now let's look at what happens when planets are actually placed inside this framework.
Moving logically to verses 13 through 18, we examine the effects of planets residing directly inside the Karakamsa. Let's translate some of these ancient verses into modern concepts. The sun in Karakamsa points to a career in government, or what they called royal assignments. A full moon aspected by Venus creates a scholar, someone who really enjoys the fine pleasures of life. Now, a strong Mars indicates someone who uses weapons, works with fire, or acts as an alchemist. In today's world, that could mean a chemist, an engineer, or even a surgeon. Jupiter brings spiritualism and Vedic learning. Venus grants a full 100 years of longevity and involvement in state affairs. And then you have Ketu, which indicates a dealer in elephants or large machinery, but interestingly, also carries a distinct risk of thievery.
Now, we have to talk about the dreaded serpent curse, which is detailed in verses 19 through 22. If Rahu and the Sun conjoin in the Karakamsa, the text predicts severe danger, or even death, from snakes, especially if a malefic planet is also aspecting them. However, the sages provided a really crucial nuance here. If this terrifying Sun-Rahu combination occupies benefic Shatvargas, meaning it holds strength across 6 specific divisional charts, the curse actually flips. Instead of being the victim, the native becomes a highly skilled doctor who specializes in treating poisonous afflictions. It's a complete 180.
So we keep mentioning aspects and strength. Let's get into the aspectual mathematics behind how that is actually measured. To truly grasp these predictions, we have to transition over to the rigorous mathematical astronomy found on page 258 of the source text. When you look at the speculum of aspectual values, you realize ancient researchers weren't just guessing. They quantified planetary gaze using a mathematical unit called virupas. It's pure geometry. By calculating the exact longitudinal distance between the aspecting planet and the Karakamsa, they assigned a very precise numeric value to the strength of that planet's influence.
These calculations require very specific mathematical additions, depending on the planet involved. For example, if Mars is aspecting and the angular distance is between 90 and 120 degrees, you literally have to add 15 virupas to the base speculum value. For Jupiter, if the angle sits between 120 and 150 degrees, you add 30 virupas. And for Saturn, if the angle is between 60 and 90 degrees, a massive 45 virupas are added. This exact step-by-step formula objectively proves the mathematical weight of the aspect.
And it gets deeper. To find the astronomical strength known as the bhuja, which, simply put, is the distance from the nearest equinox, you take the degrees, multiply them by specific planetary values called khandas, and then divide by 30. There are also these really precise rasi or zodiac adjustments you have to make. If the Moon and Saturn are placed in Libra or ahead, you add 3 rasis, but if they're placed from Aries to Virgo, you subtract 3. It is a brilliant, highly structured astronomical equation.
We then build on this math to measure absolute good versus absolute evil. This is found on page 290, specifically verses 5 and 6. To find the Ishtaphala, which is the benefic tendency, you combine a planet's exaltation rays, known as Ucha, with its motional rays, called Chesta, and you divide that by 2. That gives you the auspicious rays. Then to find the planet's pure malefic tendency, the Kastaphala, you simply subtract that Ishtaphala from 60. This exact math dictates exactly how a planet is going to behave when it's interacting with the Karakamsa.
Now that we have our mathematical foundation, let's explore how this applies to disease indicators and medical astrology. Ancient researchers diagnosed incredibly severe physical diseases simply by analyzing the 4th and 5th houses from the Karakamsa. When we break down verses 36 through 40 and then verses 77 through 84, we see this incredible diagnostic precision. If Rahu and Mars are sitting in the 4th or 5th house from the Karakamsa, it mathematically proves a high susceptibility to pulmonary consumption, a diagnosis that becomes virtually certain if the Moon is also aspecting them. Mars alone or aspecting these houses indicates severe boils or ulcers. Ketu's presence is a warning for dysentery and waterborne diseases. If the Moon is sitting in the 4th house and receiving an aspect from Venus, the text predicts white leprosy. Furthermore, if you find the mathematical point known as Gulika in these houses, it indicates extreme danger from poisons.
We also have to contrast the structural effects of the other houses here. Verse 49 is very clear. Benefics in the 8th house from the Karakamsa grant a long span of life, while malefics reduce longevity. But in stark contrast, verses 50 through 56 analyze the 9th house, which governs morality. Benefics here make a native inherently truthful and devoted to their elders. However, if malefics occupy the 9th house, it's a completely different story. The person might appear religious in their youth, but they will inevitably turn to falsehood in old age and actively betray their elders.
Which brings us to part 6, the climax of today's deep dive, the highly feared Kamadadrama Yoga.
This is a specific planetary combination representing the total loss of intelligence, extreme poverty, and immense suffering. On page 340, verses 94 through 99 outline exactly how this devastating combination is formed strictly from the Katakamsa framework. The simple English translation of this rather complex shloka is this: if malefic planets occupy the Katakamsa, the Aruda Lagna, and simultaneously sit in the 2nd and 8th houses from these places, the severe Kamadruma Yoga is formed. And if the Moon also happens to aspect this alignment, those destructive effects are magnified significantly. This brilliantly illustrates how different chapters of the text actively corroborate each other. If we jump over to chapter 38, verses 11 through 13 on page 386, we find additional structural rules for the Kamadruma Yoga. It states that, excluding the Sun, if there are absolutely no planets placed with the Moon, nor in the 2nd and 12th houses adjacent to the Moon, nor in any angles from the ascendant, the Kamadruma Yoga is locked in. The result? The native is intensely reproached, bereft of learning and intelligence, and reduced to absolute penury.
So let's summarize all of this and look at our next steps.
Honestly, it's just incredible to see how this ancient text masterfully synthesizes such deep spiritual concepts with real-world outcomes, like severe diseases, strictly through this mathematical framework. Let's quickly review the core takeaways. We started by identifying the Atmakaraka's Navamsa placement as the fundamental blueprint. We then saw how zodiac signs and resident planets dictate everything from your daily livelihood to severe curses, like that Sun Rahu serpent curse we talked about. We learned that the precise Virapa mathematics and Ishtapatla calculations are what determine the exact objective strength of those outcomes. And finally, we explored how the 4th and 5th houses reveal specific medical diseases and how exact malefic geometry forms the poverty-inducing Kamadruma yoga.
Now, this framework is incredibly vast, and we are not stopping here. In our next analysis, we'll be moving forward into the subsequent teachings. Specifically, we'll be looking at Chapter 34, Verse 1, where the sage completes these Karakamsa teachings and instructs the Brahmin, saying, "Thus I have told you about the effects derivable through Karakamsa. Now listen to the effects arising out of planetary house lordships." That introduces the insanely powerful Yoga Karakas, which we'll cover next time.
So I want to leave you at this final thought. If ancient researchers could use a single Navamsa placement to mathematically prove deep physical ailments, chart exact career paths, and predict extreme poverty through pure planetary geometry, what hidden strengths and perhaps undiscovered curses lie buried in your own astronomical alignments? Until next time, keep calculating and keep seeking.